This is Samuel. He was humiliated in a classroom of a great college in front of dozens of classmates, just because his strength did not come from books, but from God. That professor, with all his academic wisdom, tried to corner him, ridicule his faith, and turn him into an example of primitive thinking. Little did he know that he was, in fact, challenging divine wisdom itself. Sometimes the silence of a righteous person echoes louder than the cry of the arrogant, and God's answer comes from where it is least expected. Has your faith ever been tested like that in front of everyone, where defending what you believe could cost you your reputation? Before I tell you how God honored this young man's faith in front of the one who humiliated him, comment here where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when we place things in His hands and trust in His perfect timing. The way this story unfolds is a powerful reminder that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, and that the best weapon is a faith that does not waver. The conflict began to take shape long before that fateful day. The law school was a cold place, not just in its marble architecture and long silent corridors, but in its soul. For Samuel, a young black man from a community where faith was daily bread, that environment was a mission field disguised as an intellectual challenge. He felt the constant weight of having to prove himself. It wasn't enough to be intelligent. He had to be twice as articulate, twice as prepared, so that his presence there would not be seen as a quota or a favor, but as a right earned with sweat and prayer. The epicenter of this coldness was the legal philosophy class taught by Professor Antunes. He was a campus legend, a sharp intellectual, author of several books, and possessor of a cynicism he mistook for genius. For Antunes, reason was the only light, and anything outside of it, especially religious faith, was a darkness to be fought with contempt and merciless logic. He delighted in deconstructing students' certainties, but his favorite targets were naive beliefs. Samuel, with his serene manner and calm gaze, was an irritating enigma to the professor, a piece that did not fit on his chessboard of skepticism. Samuel was not a man of fiery theological debates. His faith was his foundation, the invisible force that made him wake up at 4 a.m. to catch 2 buses to get to the university. It was the peace he felt when praying with his mother before leaving home, his knee on the floor of his simple room, asking God not only for wisdom for the exams, but for armor for his soul. He saw his studies as a mission God had given him, a way to honor his family's sacrifice and one day to use the law to defend those who, like him, came from a place where justice often did not reach. In that classroom, the atmosphere was one of veiled competition. The students, mostly from wealthy families with an already charted future, vied for Professor Antunes' attention and approval. They laughed at his acidic jokes, agreed with his provocations, and adopted his posture of intellectual superiority. Samuel's humility, his refusal to enter the game of rhetorical aggression, was interpreted by them as weakness, as if he lacked the capacity for debate. Little did they know that Samuel's strength was not in his tongue, but in his spirit, trained to endure and trust. With each class, the tension grew. Professor Antunes seemed to orbit around Samuel, launching indirect questions and general comments about how dependence on supernatural entities impeded human progress. Samuel felt the sidelong glances, the disguised smirks. He clung to a passage his pastor always quoted, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He didn't feel like a victim. He felt he was in a trial. That would forge his character. He just prayed in silence, asking God to guard his heart from bitterness. On that particular day, the air was thicker. The topic of the class was the origin of morality, a perfect setup for the professor. He walked around the room with a malicious glint in his eyes, parading theories from philosophers who reduced good and evil to mere social conventions, to tools of control. Samuel felt in his spirit that something was about to happen. It was a feeling he knew, well, a spiritual warning that prepared him for battle. He took a deep breath and asked God, "Lord, give me the right word, or give me the grace of silence. May your will be done." Then the professor stopped in the middle of the room, like a predator that finally finds its prey. He made a broad gesture with his hands and declared aloud, for all to hear, "In the end, morality is just a social contract to avoid chaos. And God? God is humanity's most brilliant and enduring invention to control the masses, to give the weak a reason not to despair. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with expectation. Samuel gripped his pen tightly, his heart beating a little faster. With a smirk, Professor Antunes turned slowly, and his eyes locked on Samuel, who was sitting in the third row. The movement was deliberate, theatrical. The entire class followed his gaze, and suddenly, Samuel was the center of the universe. The professor tilted his head, his tone dripping with sarcasm and challenge. "And you, Samuel?" he asked, his voice echoing in the silent room. "With all your dedication coming from where you come from, do you still believe in fairy tales to justify good and evil? Do you still need that crutch to walk?" The question was not academic. It was an attack, a trap set to humiliate him publicly. The silence that fell over the room was unlike any other. It was not a silence of academic attention, but of pure, cruel expectation. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Samuel, and he could feel the weight of each gaze like a stone. Some classmates seemed to delight in the scene, eager for the spectacle of his humiliation. Others looked away, a mixture of shame and cowardice. In that instant, Samuel was not in a classroom, but in an arena. The professor was the lion and he the prey, but instead of the panic everyone expected, a supernatural calm began to fill his chest. It was the peace that surpasses all understanding, the same he felt in his deepest prayers. "Professor." Antunes leaned back slightly against the desk, crossing his arms. The posture was of someone who already knew the outcome. He expected a stutter, a defensive and poorly formulated response that he could dissect with his sharp logic, or perhaps an outburst of anger that would prove his point about the irrationality of faith. He had set the stage and the script, and now he just awaited the disastrous performance of his unwitting protagonist. That smug smile on his face was that of a man who not only believed he was right, but who took pleasure in using reason as a weapon to crush what he did not understand. The air was thick with his arrogance, but Samuel did not follow the script. He did not open his mouth immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, once. A simple, almost imperceptible act, but one that broke the rhythm of the execution. The air that filled his lungs seemed to bring with it the strength of generations of ancestors who had faced much greater trials with the same faith. He slowly raised his head, and his eyes met the professor's. There was no defiance in his gaze, no fear, no anger. There was only a disconcerting serenity, a firmness that did not come from self-pride, but from a conviction that resided much deeper, in a place the professor's mockery could not reach. Then his voice came out, clear and steady, without any tremor. It was not loud, but it cut through the silence of the room with a quiet authority. "Professor, you have every right not to believe," he began, and this first sentence already disarmed the aggressiveness of the attack. By granting the professor the right to his disbelief, Samuel changed the frame. He was not there to fight, but to testify. He was not defending himself, he was affirming himself. His body posture, erect but relaxed, communicated that he did not feel cornered. He was planted on his rock, and the wind could blow as it pleased. He continued, and his next words were the heart of his response, the living testimony that no theory could refute. "But my faith is not a theory to be debated on a blackboard, Professor. It is the peace I feel when I lay my head on the pillow at night after a day of struggle. It is the strength that made me cross the city today, leaving home before sunrise to be here learning from you." He transformed the abstraction of faith into something concrete, real and palpable, peace and strength. These were feelings that everyone in the room, in some way, sought, even if by other means, and he concluded with the same calm and respectful tone, looking directly into the eyes of the man who tried to ridicule him. "This peace and this strength, Professor, no book can give me, and no argument can take away." The sentence hung in the air, simple, direct, and unassailable. He had not quoted the Bible, had not entered into philosophical discussions. He had simply presented the evidence of his own life. The silence that followed was profound, but this time it was a silence of shock. The trap had been dismantled, as Samuel refused to fight on the enemy's ground. He brought the fight to his territory, that of lived experience. Professor Antunes was visibly shaken. That cynical smile vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of disbelief. He opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it. What argument could he use against a man's peace? How could he refute the strength that had brought him there? Samuel had not given him a thesis to deconstruct. He had given him a testimony. For an instant, the great intellectual was speechless, disarmed not by a superior logic, but by the simplicity of a faithful heart's truth. The arrogance in his eyes gave way to an almost imperceptible confusion. The dynamic in the room changed instantly. The condescending laughter died. Some of the students who were previously smiling now looked down at their notebooks, suddenly interested in their notes. Others looked at Samuel in a new light, a mixture of surprise and perhaps a drop of admiration. They had just witnessed something rare, dignity overcoming arrogance, not with a shout, but with a whisper of conviction. Samuel's silent strength exposed the professor's loud fragility. The respect in the room, which was once directed at the master, was now divided. Regaining his composure, Professor Antunes cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and with an abrupt gesture, changed the subject. "Well, returning to Kant," he said, his voice a little more tense than usual. He continued the lecture, but the magic of his authority had been broken. His words seemed hollow, his rhetoric empty. He had tried to turn Samuel into an example of weakness, and in the process ended up revealing his own. Everyone in the room knew that the professor had not won that clash. In fact, he hadn't even managed to fight. At the end of the class, while packing his things, Samuel felt neither pride nor triumph. He felt an immense and silent gratitude. Gratitude to God for having given him the right words and, more importantly, the right spirit to utter them. He remembered his mother telling him the night before, as they prayed together, "My son, don't ask God to shut your enemies' mouths. Ask him to fill your heart with so much peace that their noise can't reach you." And that is exactly what happened. The immediate trial had passed, but Samuel knew the journey was long. Little did he know that God was already preparing the next scene, one he could never have imagined. The weeks that followed were marked by a subtle but palpable change. Professor Antunes never mentioned the incident again, but he also stopped targeting Samuel. There was a new kind of distance between them, a space of reluctant respect created by the young man's unexpected response. Samuel's classmates also treated him differently. The look of disdain was replaced by a cautious curiosity. He, who was once invisible or a target, now possessed a gravity of his own. His faith, once seen as a weakness, was now perceived as a source of mysterious and unshakable strength. Samuel continued his routine with the same discipline and humility, thanking God for the small armistice. He was not deluded. He knew that the battle in the spiritual realm was continuous and that the peace he felt was maintained by vigilance and prayer. Every night he remembered Professor Antunes' face, not with anger, but with a kind of compassion. He saw in the professor a brilliant but spiritually hungry man, someone who fed on cold logic because perhaps he had never tasted the warmth of grace. In his prayers, Samuel began to include Antunes' name, asking God to somehow touch the heart of that man, so sure of his own wisdom. It was an act of pure faith with no expectation of a visible result. Meanwhile, the university was buzzing with preparations for its biggest annual event, the Grand Symposium on Law and Society. The guest of honor that year was an almost mythical figure in the legal world, Dr. Afonso Ribeiro, an internationally renowned jurist whose works were the basis of the legal philosophy course. For Professor Antunes, Afonso Ribeiro was more than a professional colleague. He was an idol, the personification of the intellectual excellence he so sought. Antunes quoted him constantly in his classes, almost with reverence, and the anticipation for his lecture was immense, especially for him. The day of the symposium arrived. The main auditorium was packed. Professors, students, lawyers, and judges jostled for a seat. Samuel found a seat in the back, as usual. He wasn't there for the academic fandom, but for the opportunity to learn. Sitting there amidst the country's intellectual elite, he felt small but not intimidated. He remembered the story of David, a young shepherd whom no one noticed, until the day God decided to use him. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment and prayed, asking God to open his ears to true wisdom, wherever it might come from. Professor Antunes was in the front row, radiant, his posture erect like a proud disciple about to hear his master. When Dr. Afonso Ribeiro took the stage, an elegant grey-haired white man with a kind smile, the auditorium erupted in applause. Antunes clapped with an almost boyish enthusiasm. The lecture was brilliant, as expected. The jurist spoke about justice, ethics, and the role of law in a fractured society, with an eloquence that captured everyone's attention. Samuel listened intently, absorbing every word. At the end of the lecture, the floor was opened for questions and answers. Hands went up throughout the auditorium. Students and professors asked complex questions about legal theories and famous cases. Dr. Afonso answered them all with patience and impressive depth. Professor Antunes watched everything with a smile of satisfaction, as if his idol's brilliance reflected on him. The Q&A session was almost over when a young student from another course sitting in the front requested the microphone. The young man's question was different. It wasn't about a theory or an article of law. It was personal. "Dr. Ribeiro," he began, his voice a little nervous, "you've dealt with cases of enormous social injustice, cases that could break anyone's spirit. I would like to know, where does your resilience come from? What is the source of your strength not to give up in the face of so much evil in the world?" The question hung in the auditorium, and a curious silence set in. Everyone leaned forward, eager for the answer. It was a question that touched on something deeper than the law. Dr. Afonso Ribeiro, the great international jurist, was silent for a moment. His face, previously formal and academic, softened. A nostalgic and genuine smile appeared on his lips. He looked far away, over the heads of the audience, as if searching for a cherished memory. The entire auditorium held its breath. Professor Antunes watched, fascinated, waiting, perhaps, for a quote from some Stoic philosopher or a complex psychological insight. He had no idea he was about to hear something that would shake the foundations of his world. Then, the jurist began to speak, his voice soft and charged with emotion. "Many of you, my future colleagues, think that my strength comes from the books I've read, the codes I've memorized, or the theories I've studied. And yes, all that helps. They are important tools." He paused, and his gaze seemed to find a fixed point in the past. "But in truth, the real source of my strength, my anchor, comes from a very simple man, a man most of you would call ignorant. He was the black gardener who worked at my parents' house when I was a boy." Upon hearing the mention of the black gardener, Professor Antunes's body stiffened. A sudden tension took hold of him. Samuel, there in the back of the auditorium, felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't know why, but he felt that this moment was, for him. An invisible connection was formed between the story of that famous jurist and his own journey. Dr. Afonso continued, his voice choked with memory. "One day, he found me in the garden, desperate about a math test. I was just a boy, and I thought that problem was the end of the world. He stopped what he was doing, looked at me with those eyes full of a wisdom not learned in books, and told me a sentence that changed my life forever. A sentence I repeat to myself before every great challenge, before every difficult hearing." The jurist took a dramatic pause. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. All eyes were fixed on him, waiting for the revelation of that powerful phrase. Professor Antunes, in the front row, was motionless, his face a mask of bewilderment. His idol's narrative was taking a completely unexpected turn, straying from the certainties of academia to the uncertain terrain of popular wisdom, of simple faith. Samuel, for his part, felt his heart beat. Faster, a spiritual anticipation that God was about to manifest himself in a spectacular way. It was as if the entire auditorium was on the edge of a cliff, about to witness something transformative. Then, with a clear and resonant voice, Dr. Afonso Ribeiro shared the wisdom that guided him. "My son," he quoted, and his voice seemed to carry the accent and tenderness of that old gardener. "Don't worry about the size of the giant you have to face. Just remember the size of the God who walks with you." The phrase echoed through the auditorium, simple, direct, and devastatingly powerful. It was pure theology, coming not from a seminary, but from the heart of a humble man whose only wealth was his faith. A murmur ran through the audience, followed by a wave of emotional applause. People were not just applauding the jurist's eloquence, but the universal truth contained in those words. For most, it was an inspiring moment. For Professor Antunes, it was an earthquake. He did not applaud. He froze in his chair, his face pale, his mouth slightly open in shock. Those words, that wisdom, it was the same essence of the faith he had ridiculed weeks before, coming from Samuel. The same logic he had called fairy tales and a crutch for the weak was now presented as the cornerstone of the character of the man he most admired in the world. Antunes' universe, built on the premise of the superiority of skeptical reason, was crumbling in real time, right there in the front row. The irony was divine, orchestrated with a precision that no human scriptwriter could conceive. God did not use Samuel to debate with the professor. He used the voice of Antunes' own idol to validate Samuel's faith. Justice did not come through a direct confrontation, but through a lateral revelation, an unexpected flank that left the professor's arrogance completely defenseless. It was as if God were saying, "You humiliated my servant for his simple faith? Well, know that this same simple faith formed the intellectual giant you idolize." The shame Antunes must have felt at that moment must have been overwhelming, a silent, internal humiliation, much deeper than the one he tried to impose on Samuel. As the auditorium still echoed with applause, Samuel remained in his seat quiet. Tears welled up in his eyes, but they were not of sadness. They were of pure gratitude and awe. He understood, in that instant, the purpose of his humiliation. He understood why God had given him the grace of silence and peace that day in the classroom. It was not for him to win the argument, but so that God could, in his time, win the war in a much more glorious way. Samuel's honor was not restored by his own argumentation, but by divine providence, which used the most unlikely stage to exalt him. The symposium ended, and people began to get up, to talk, to head for the exit. Professor Antunes, however, remained seated, looking at the empty stage, lost in thought. He was the picture of a man whose world had been turned upside down. The pillars of his intellectual identity had been shaken. The wisdom he despised in his black, working-class student was the same he admired in his white elite idol. The contradiction was crushing, forcing him to confront his own blindness, his own pride. Samuel did not approach him. He felt that this was a sacred moment of internal confrontation for the professor. With a heart full of deep peace, he simply gathered his materials and quietly left the auditorium. He didn't need an apology. God's action had been the apology, the vindication, and the lesson, all in one act. Walking through the college corridors, Samuel felt lighter than ever. The burden of having to prove himself had been lifted from his shoulders, not by him, but by the one who walks with the humble. The next legal philosophy class was strange. There was an expectation in the air. All the students who had been at the symposium knew what had happened. They looked at Professor Antunes and then at Samuel, trying to decipher the new dynamic. The professor entered the room not with his usual arrogant posture, but with an unusual sobriety. His tone of voice was different, more restrained, almost humble. He taught the class in a technical manner, without provocations, without cynical jokes. The energy of the room had changed forever. At the end of the class, as most students hurried to leave, Samuel slowly packed his books, as he always did. He felt a presence beside him. It was Professor Antunes. Samuel looked up, waiting. The professor seemed uncomfortable, struggling to find the words. He didn't look directly into Samuel's eyes, but at a vague spot on the wall. The silence between them lasted a few seconds, but it was not a hostile silence. It was a silence of recognition. Finally, the professor spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper, so that only Samuel could hear. "Samuel," he began and paused, swallowing hard. "About that day, about our conversation." He still couldn't call it a humiliation. "Perhaps," he continued, finally raising his eyes to meet Samuel's, "perhaps true wisdom is not only found in reason." It wasn't a full apology, but coming from a man like Antunes, it was the equivalent of a surrender. It was the recognition that there was a world beyond his books, a world where Samuel's faith had a value that he was now forced to admit. Their relationship would never be the same. That brief moment marked the beginning of a new era. Professor Antunes did not become a man of faith overnight, nor did a friendship blossom between him and Samuel. The change was deeper and more silent. In subsequent classes, Antunes began to conduct debates differently. He was still rigorous and challenging, but he had lost the cruel edge of his skepticism. Occasionally, when discussing morality or justice, he would pause and add phrases like, "Of course, that is the rational perspective, but there are other ways to approach the issue." It was a subtle concession, a nod to the world he once despised, a tacit acknowledgement of the lesson he had learned so publicly and personally. The classmates who once laughed at Samuel now looked at him with renewed respect. His calm was no longer seen as passivity, but as an unshakable strength. Some, the braver ones, approached him in the hallways, asking questions not about the subject matter, but about his perspective on life, about how he managed to maintain serenity in such a competitive environment. Samuel, with the same humility as always, shared what he could not by preaching but by witnessing with his actions. He unwittingly became a silent beacon of integrity in that college, the living proof that true strength needs no noise to be noticed. His victory was not over the professor, but over the spirit of arrogance that dominated that place. Years later, Samuel graduated with honors. He never had another direct conversation with Professor Antunes about what happened, but the silent respect between them endured until the end. On graduation day, when Samuel's name was called to receive his diploma, he saw the professor in the audience, among the other faculty. For a brief instant, their eyes met. Antunes gave a slight nod, an almost imperceptible gesture, but one that contained a universe of meaning. It was a final acknowledgement, a seal of respect that closed that chapter of their lives. Samuel knew that this man would never forget the lesson he had learned. The story of that day in class and the revelation at the symposium became a kind of legend in the college hallways. It was told and retold by the classes that came after, a reminder that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places and that humility has a strength of its own. Samuel's vindication was not an isolated event. It was a seed planted that continued to bear fruit, changing the culture of that space, making it a little less cold, a little more human. God not only honored a young man's faith, but used his trial to transform the hearts of many. For Samuel understood on that journey that he did not need to win debates to prove the value of his faith. He just needed to live it with integrity and patience. He learned that God's justice often does not announce itself with thunder and lightning, but reveals itself in its own time, in the most subtle and unexpected way, to shame those who think themselves wise and to exalt the humble in heart. His greatest victory was not having a clever answer, but having a spirit quiet enough to let God answer for him. And that is a lesson that echoes forever. If you know someone who is going through a trial and needs their faith strengthened, please share this video. Samuel's journey is a reminder that we are not alone in our struggles. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how faith in God can move mountains and bring justice in ways we can't even imagine. Thank you for listening, and may the peace of God be with you.